It's merely in office, but not in power. It has no agenda. And the fact that so much of what was in the budget was built on what would at best be described as a fib, if not a lie, I think shows that there's just no credibility behind Rachel Reeves or Keir Starmer anymore.
Was Rachel Reeves right to raise taxes, to increase spending on welfare in the name of equality, in the name of taxing the rich and so on?
Absolutely not. This is a disastrous budget. We are getting to the end of the road. We've been kicking the can down the road economically in Britain for 20 years, raising taxes, racking up more debt, doing all of that in the pretense that it's somehow going to make us rich and prosperous. In fact, it is wrecking the economy. There is very little growth. Productivity is atrocious. And this budget is, I think, the last gasp of a failed Treasury orthodoxy. It's socialism by the back door. It's socialism that you never voted for. But like all socialism, it will be and is being ruinous. It's one of the reasons why so many young Britons are now leaving the country.
Is it the last gasp of this Labour government and Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves's sort of superiority in this government? Maybe it could force them to resign in the next few months.
I don't think this government is going to recover in terms of its credibility. It may limp on for 2, 3, heaven forbid, almost 4 years, but I don't think they can recover their credibility. Look, when they were elected just over a year ago, we were told that the adults were back in the room. They had a massive parliamentary majority. They could have done anything they wanted to. One of the things that a sensible, responsible left-wing government ought to try to do is to reform welfare so that welfare actually helps people who need it. They tried rather half-heartedly to do that. Their backbenchers wouldn't even allow them to reduce the rate at which the welfare bill was growing. And ever since then, they've made no attempt to try to rein in government spending. And Britain is in an economic mess fundamentally because public spending is far too high. In 2007-8, when I was a new MP in the House of Commons, the total amount of public debt in Britain was about 40% of GDP. That was about 40% of our annual wealth, if you like, was debt. It's now getting on for 100% of GDP. And under this government, it's only rising. It's only going to go up. So I think what we see in this latest budget is any attempt for this government to actually get on top of Britain's problems. It's abandoned that. It's merely in office, but not in power. It has no agenda. And the fact that so much of what was in the budget was built on what would at best be described as a fib, if not a lie, I think shows that there's just no credibility behind Rachel Reeves or Keir Starmer anymore.
One of the major policy announcements in the budget was the removing of the two-child benefit cap. Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister, put out a statement celebrating this. He says, ending the two-child rule is more than securing the immediate release of children from poverty. It is an invest now, save later policy. Isn't this a pro-family policy? Do you embrace this ending the two-child benefit cap?
Well, I think it's certainly a continuation of Brownian economics. It's why Gordon Brown supported it. Look, there is an argument for saying, given the collapsing birth rates around the Western world, that like Hungary, we should have a policy that is aggressively natalist, that helps people who have more kids. Now, Hungary has done this such that when you have a certain number of kids, you basically stop paying any income tax. Now, there's an argument for doing that. But what we've seen here, I don't think is a concerted pro-natalist policy. I think what this is the Labour Party quite clearly cutting its client groups. A lot of its coalition is now essentially an ethnic headcount. It's cutting its client groups a tax break. This is not a concerted attempt to raise the British birth rate. I think it's a bung for some of its core supporters.
Of course, the government have been talking a lot about the debt and deficit and equality. And I'm looking at a graph here produced by the Resolution Foundation, which suggests that the majority of the people being punished in this budget are going to be those who are better off. Isn't that a fairer way to deal with the national debt, to deal with the deficit, to deal with all these issues, is to tax the rich and help the poor?
But what we often hear is people saying that, people with broader shoulders have to take more of the burden. The problem is that if you tax the productive people in a society in this day and age, they can and they will move. It's not a coincidence that under this government, the number of young adult Britons leaving the country is now at a record high. Why do you think they're leaving? Why do you think young doctors and nurses are moving to Australia? Why do you think that young tech entrepreneurs are moving to Dubai? It's because you now have a ruinously high rate of taxation. Anyone who tries to get ahead and make a go of their life, anyone who earns more than £100,000, ends up paying an extortionate amount in taxation. It's all very well for people to say, well, the richer must shoulder their share. But why is taking 4 out of every £10 that somebody earns considered fair? I think that actually a fairer system of taxation would be what we have here in Mississippi, which is a flat rate taxation where everyone pays the same percentage on income tax. Here you pay a flat 4% income tax. Incidentally, we're about to phase that out altogether. But if you want fairness, you should have flat taxes. The idea that there's something fair about taxing people who work hard and earn more and try to make something of their lives, it's absurd. People who pay those ruinous rates of taxation are not going to sit around and have the state expropriate the lion's share of their wealth. They're going to move. They're going to leave. And what happens then, every time you have a wealthy person leave the country, the rest of us left behind in that country then have to pay their tax bill. And this is the tragedy of it. Taxing rich people doesn't mean that you end up with a just and fair society. It means you end up with more and more people voting to put the tax bill on a smaller and smaller number of productive people. And that is no way to run a country. We tried this in the 1970s, for goodness sake. We tried this in the 1950s. We know it doesn't work. It's not going to work this time.
So Keir Starmer has come out and defended the budget. Obviously, people aren't happy about the tax rises and so on. And he said this, quote, "There was an OBR productivity review. The result of that was there was a £16 billion less than we might have had otherwise. That's a difficult starting point for any budget. Now, Labour have criticised the OBR because of their handling of all of this stuff and basically blaming them for a lot of the reasons why they've had to raise taxes. What do you make of Keir Starmer's defence?"
I'm no fan of the OBR. The OBR is a quango, a government body created by George Osborne, and like many of the things that George Osborne did, it turns out to be pretty disastrous. It was created to supposedly provide objective assessments and forecasts. Its forecasts have been pretty abysmal. I'm no defender of the OBR, but the idea that somehow what's going on can be blamed on the OBR, I just don't buy it. Look, the amount of money that the government takes in taxation every year is at a record high in Britain. It's now 38% of GDP. It's going to be the highest sustained rate in peacetime in Britain. We are seeing a huge amount of Britain's wealth now taken in taxation. This has happened under a government, and it's happened entirely unnecessarily. Why? Because Keir Starmer and his Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, went out of their way to imply, to pretend that there was a black hole in the budget numbers. And we now know that that simply isn't true. They were, in effect, scaremongering to justify what are essentially socialist tax rises. This is not only deceitful and dishonest, it's also economically mad, because as the economy needs to grow, if you increase the tax take, you will suppress growth. The budget projects a pathetic 1.5% increase in growth this year. That is an extraordinarily low figure. I think even that is probably wildly optimistic. So I don't think we can blame the OBR for this budget. There's plenty about the OBR that is wrong, and I personally think the OBR needs to be abolished. They've got many things badly wrong. But I think the idea that somehow Keir Starmer should be able to get away by saying it wasn't us, Gov, it was the OBR, that's just nonsense.
It's quite a typical Labour thing to do. I mean, I suppose the Tories used to do it as well, where they would blame an independent body for a decision that ultimately they could and perhaps even should have the responsibility for. Do you think, obviously, I know the answer to this, but can you talk to us about the kind of quangocracy in Britain that politicians have put these political decisions into so-called independent bodies so that they won't be criticised for, government policy?
Governments of all parties have, over the past 30 years, created these so-called independent bodies, quangos. And what they do is that they set them up and they say that they're going to be populated by experts, and whether it's setting interest rates at the Bank of England or overseeing the budget numbers in the budget or overseeing the environment or overseeing climate change targets, they create these independent bodies and they then defer to these bodies as though somehow these unelected bodies will always make the right decision. And what we know quite clearly is that these unelected bodies often make the wrong decisions. They make bad decisions. They set interest rates too low when they should have raised them. They raise interest rates when they should have lowered them. They get their maths wrong when it comes to budgets. Again and again and again, we see the quango state, the British administrative state, getting things disastrously wrong. The problem is, though, that ministers set up these organizations, give them responsibility, and then blame them when things go wrong. And this is why I think fundamentally people in the country are so disaffected and disillusioned politically. We vote for governments to cut immigration, but an agency set up by the government recommends that we allow the world to come and work here. We vote for governments that will spend our tax pounds wisely, and yet we end up with a quango that can't even get basic forecasts. So I think there's a real frustration amongst voters with these unelected bodies, but politicians don't really seem to get the message. They seem to think that so long as they can blame these unelected bodies, they can somehow get away with it. Well, frankly, we don't elect the OBR to run the country. So why are we blaming the OBR? If the OBR is not up to it, get rid of it. What we do is elect parties to run the country, to set tax and spend priorities. Incidentally, when people voted for the current Labour government to run the country, they did so on the express understanding that Labour was not going to raise taxes, that they were not going to increase taxes the way they have. So what we're seeing down here, I think, is a complete breakdown of the democratic system. The unelected quangos being blamed, the ministers reneging on election promises. And then people wonder why a growing number of voters are looking to the extremes, to the Green Party or to reform. Well, it's no surprise.
Zach Polanski, the leader of the Green Party, said this on the BBC when he was discussing economic policy. Quote, "In terms of the borrowing, a lot of borrowing is from the Bank of England. That's money we owe to ourselves. It's not borrowing or a debt in any real sense. Also, it's a lot of foreign countries who want to have that debt because actually that's a good investment for them because we have a relatively stable currency." So, Douglas Carswell, let's just borrow lots more money. It's just money we owe to ourselves.
I wouldn't put Mr. Polanski in charge of running a local corner shop. His understanding of basic economics is pretty flawed. He has this sort of fantasy view that somehow debt is not real, that somehow we can live beyond our means, we can borrow and print money. Now, other countries have tried this. There have been a number of countries around the world that tried Polanski economics, and it didn't end well. If you treat the people who buy your debt, the international bondholders, with the contempt that Mr. Polanski would. What tends to happen is they stop buying your debt. They stop buying your bonds. Now, we've seen this happen a number of times to countries like Argentina. It's only really once happened in the UK in the late 1970s. If a man like Mr. Polanski were to get in, I can tell you what would happen. You would get what is known as a bond strike right away. People would simply refuse to lend the British government any more money. And what would then happen is you would get catastrophic inflation, because Polanski would end up printing money. And the more money he printed, the less value that the money that you had in your bank account would hold. We've been in this situation. Other countries have been in this situation. I find it pretty extraordinary that a frontline politician in Britain should be advocating essentially third world banana republic economics. But that's where Polanski economics would take us. It would reduce us to the status of a banana republic. And unlike a banana republic, we wouldn't at least be able to produce something that people might want to eat.
I want to quote a report from The Observer discussing a meeting with the Treasury Minister Torsten Bell. It says this: speaking fast and furiously, Bell embarked on a foul-mouthed tirade, laying bare the scale of the economic and political challenges facing the government. It was F this, F that. We've got to F them all, and then we've got to F them some more, one source said. What do you make of this attitude, perhaps even a radicalism, or some could argue unprofessionalism, towards the government's economic policies and the challenges facing the government from someone like Torsten Bell?
We've seen people like Torsten Bell run the country for the past 2 decades, and they've done a pretty good job of running it into the ground. What do I mean by that? Like Torsten Bell, a man who goes to Oxbridge, gets a very clever degree, works as a special advisor, a so-called SPAD, for a few years, is parachuted into a safe seat, in his case, Swansea, and then instantly arrives in Westminster and is made part of the governing team. We've seen this before. Ed Balls was similar. George Osborne was similar. David Cameron was similar. Matt Hancock was similar. Ed Miliband was very similar. I think being governed by these smug, self-satisfied spads has been disastrous. It has been catastrophic for the country. I always look rather dimly on people who resort to foul language, particularly in meetings with underlings. Why? Because I think if you need to use profanities to express your thoughts probably aren't really worth articulating in the first place. What we see in Torsten Bell is someone who clearly thinks a lot, clearly thinks he's frightfully clever, and clearly is imposing on the country the latest fashionable leftist ideas from the Resolution Foundation, where he used to work. I think it is proving fairly catastrophic. One of the reasons why Mississippi, where I now live, where I'm talking to you from, has now overtaken the UK in terms of per capita GDP and is now a wealthier place than Britain. One of the reasons why this has happened is because in Mississippi, we don't have people like Torsten Bell or Ed Miliband or George Osborne able to impose their fashionable, too clever by half ideas on the rest of us. The fact that Britain is at the mercy of a succession of too clever by half spads is one of the reasons why Britain is in a mess. Britain once produced really good leaders, capable leaders, even on the left, men like Beveridge. Today we're seeing Britain governed by Oxbridge PPE graduates who have a tremendous capacity for passing Oxbridge exams, but lack basic wisdom.
I know that you've written extensively about your plan or your ideas for the future of the country. If you were the Chancellor, what would you have announced in your budget?
I would immediately try to rein in public spending, and I would look over the next 5 years to reduce public spending to the rate that it was before COVID. public spending in Britain is close to 45% of GDP. I would aim over the course of a 5-year parliament to reduce it to 40% of GDP. In a second parliament, I would aim to reduce it back to about 35% of GDP. That is the optimum, roughly the optimum level that it needs to be. Fundamentally, Britain is in a mess because the public sector is spending too much. Britain needs to reduce public spending. And I think actually it ought not to be that difficult to do that. Why do I say that? Because you're talking about reducing public spending to roughly where it was when Tony Blair left office. Now, Tony Blair was a Labour Prime Minister. He was in office for quite a long time. Reducing public spending back to the level it was when Tony Blair was Prime Minister is not radical. It's not extreme. It's not libertarian. What is extreme is believing that we can continue to have public spending at the rate that it is today. We've got this massive deficit. That means that we are spending much more than we're taking in tax. The government is trying to raise the tax rate to keep up with public spending. What it ought to be doing is reducing public spending. There are other things, by the way, I would do. I would remove many of the unnecessary restrictions on building in Britain. We've inherited a whole bunch of, frankly, utterly useless environmental directives from the EU, from when we were in the EU. I would get rid of those. I think we need a building boom. I would remove the restrictions on fracking. One of the reasons that the southern US, where I'm talking to you from, is roaring ahead economically, and one of the reasons why America overall is so successful is because of cheap energy. Britain has enormous quantities of energy underground. It's got this absurd ban on fracking. I would remove the ban on fracking. I would remove many of the restrictions on planning. I would also do something to free up the labour market. I think that if you're in the United Kingdom and you're wondering why the economy isn't doing well, it's not just because energy is high and taxes are high. It's because the cost of labour is so high. And one of the reasons for that is that labour has too many socialist protections. So I would essentially allow anyone to hire and fire at will for the first 90 days of employment. I think you should be able to employ someone for a period of about 3 months. And if it doesn't work out, you should be able to leave the job or move on or say goodbye to that member of staff without having to pay out any compensation. I think if you did that, you would reduce unemployment, which is beginning to tick up. So what Britain needs is lower taxes, achieved through lower public spending, lower energy costs, freedom to build, and lower labour costs. If you did all of that, you would start to see growth. Don't do that, and you see this anemic growth. The OBR is projecting that the British economy will grow at just over 0.5% this year. That is pathetic. That is incredibly low. And you know, look across the Atlantic. Look to the United States. Look at how America is roaring ahead. When I first became a member of Parliament, the average American was about 10% richer than the average Briton. Today, the average American is 40% richer than the average Briton. The only way Britain is going to do something about that is reduce public spending, reduce taxes, cut energy costs, and make labour more flexible.
So your aim is to reduce public spending by 10% after 2 parliaments. Now that's about £100 billion. It's a lot of money. That's almost as much as we spend on the NHS. It's about the same amount of money that we spend on servicing the public debt or the national debt interest rate or interest every year. So where are you taking this 100 billion from exactly? That's, as I said, vast
It's
amount
actually
of money.
a little bit more than that. I wrote a fairly detailed paper at the beginning of this year called Milestones, and I put forward a budget in that. I think from memory, it's about 140 billion reduction. Where's that going to come from? Very good question. Sadly, you can't achieve all of that by ending foreign aid and cutting a few woke programs. You're going to need something more substantial. What do you need to do? You need to tackle the universal credit. Far too many people are in receipt of universal credit, not least many foreigners. I think I'm right in saying that about 1 in 5 people receiving universal credit is a foreigner. You need to reduce significantly the welfare budget. PIPs other schemes like that were intended to assist people who genuinely couldn't work have now become a lifestyle choice for people who want to stay at home and play video games and not work. You need far-reaching welfare reform. You also, I think, need to reduce the size of the administrative state in Whitehall. Now, plenty of governments have talked about doing this. Nothing ever gets done. You need, like Argentina, from day one, to reduce the number of government departments. And I outlined in my paper plans to eliminate about a third of all government departments. That would achieve some significant savings. So welfare reform, reducing the number of government departments. I avoided talking about pension reform and the triple lock because I wanted to see if I could come up with a way of reducing government spending without messing with the triple lock. I think I found a way of doing that, but I can well see that a sensible grown-up government that actually wants to reverse Britain's decline might also at some point have to be honest with the public and say, look, we cannot continue to have a triple lock. What is the triple lock? The triple lock basically means that if you're a pensioner, your pension is guaranteed to rise faster than average wages. And I don't think that that is sustainable. Why? Because it's not fair on the working generation. It's not fair on our grandkids. So I think there does need to be pension reform. But I think pension reform should come after we have reduced the number of government departments, reduced the number of quangos, and frankly got a lot of the shirkers who are on welfare off of welfare.
Isn't the truth that all Western democracies face today, because of the declining birth rates, which is what we talked about at the start of the interview, we don't have the same number of people in those working age population, which is so crucial for government tax receipts. We have an aging population, which means an increased burden.
You're looking at it backwards, Stephen.
On the NHS, but hold on, let me just finish the question and then you can respond. Increased burden on the NHS, increased burden on pensions, and therefore all Western governments, all Western democracies, which has a pension system, which has a welfare state, government spending is going to increase as a percentage of GDP because of the declining birth rates and so on.
Stephen, you're looking at it backwards. Birth rates are falling because government spending is so high, and government spending is so high that it expropriates wealth from people in the prime of their life who would otherwise be able to afford to have larger families. If you ask women who have one child why they didn't have a second, who wanted one, or who had two children but wanted to have a third, and that's really where actually, if you look at demographic decline, the real problem is. It's the woman who has two kids who can't afford the third. If you ask them why they couldn't afford it, it's often for reasons that in the long term are actually pretty trivial. They felt it would be too expensive. They felt they couldn't afford it. They felt it would reduce their standard of living. We should stop taxing people like that in order to allow them to have larger families. When we say that we need, the falling birth rate means that we need a more expansive state. It's the expansive state that has hammered the birth rate. What we need to do is to give young families, people in their 20s and 30s, who are having that first and second child, the tax breaks and the opportunities to have larger families. That's what we need to do. It's not purely about fiscal calculations. If you look at Israel, a country that has a growing birth rate, it's clear to me, at least, that many of the reasons why birth rates in Israel are so healthy is because people have a sense of belief, a sense of something bigger than themselves, often a religious belief, but not even necessarily a religious belief, a secular belief that they're part of something bigger than themselves. We need to recapture that in Britain. We need to rediscover that. But certainly we can do a lot fiscally. But if we carry on with this Treasury orthodoxy that says that falling birth rates mean that we need to import immigrant workers and raise taxes, all we're ending up with is further suppressing the indigenous birth rate and essentially demographic replacement. I don't really think that is a long-term, to use the Treasury's favorite phrase, sustainable approach. What we need is a radically different policy based on the needs of young families and young family formation amongst Britons in the country today.
Somewhere like Hungary has tried to implement fiscal policies to boost the birth rate, and apparently it's worked a little bit, but has had little impact overall. This falling birth rate applies all across the West, including in America, which, you know, you've been talking about in this interview, how rich Americans are, how we should copy American policy on taxation and so on. Yet in America, they also have a declining birth rate. So it's not just about fiscal policy, is it? There's also lots of cultural reasons why this is happening.
Absolutely. I think there's a danger that people like me who think about economic policy, perhaps more than is good for us, tend to look at everything as being a problem that can be solved by economics. And I'm not sure that that is the case. There are things that we could do to help, like giving families fiscal tax breaks. There's an awful lot we could do to help families have larger to help young couples have larger families. But I think there is very much a cultural dimension to this. That we've always assumed, I think, in the West, that the future is inevitably going to be more secular and more rational. I think what people like me who assumed the future was secular and rational need to do is to pause and wonder if maybe secular rationalism is quite so rational. What secular rationalism has done is encourage large numbers of women not to do what they, I think, would like to do, which is to have families, to have children. It's encouraged a large number of people in the West to believe that they are perfectly rational and everything they do is based on reason, but they've ended up worshipping the cult of climate change and the insanity that is St. Greta Thunberg. I think secular rationalism is not quite so rational after all. Perhaps the old-time ideas, the ideas of people like Jordan Peterson, which incidentally are wildly popular amongst young Westerners. Perhaps there's truths in those old-time beliefs that secular rationalists have underestimated. I don't really think we should assume that if we are secular rationalists, the future will be secular and rationalist. Look at parts of London today that are clearly not secular rationalist. That is the future of the West, unless perhaps the West rediscovers something of its origins and its founding beliefs. I was very struck by a book I read a few years ago by the wonderful historian Tom Holland called Dominion. And it talked about how so many of the things that we in the West take for granted were actually built on the beliefs of Christian humanists. And I think perhaps we need to pay more attention to Christian humanism, or maybe even just the Christian bit, than the Western rationalists assume that we need to. Perhaps if we're secular rationalists, we will find that our way of life is a one-generation thing.
Okay, Douglas Carswell, thank you so much for joining us.